So we need to talk about a very important case that was just argued in front of the Supreme Court. This case attempts to build off of a prior 9-0 unanimous ruling of the Supreme Court, which impacts your right to prevent the warrantless entry into your homes. So let's talk about what happened during these arguments and what happens in this case going forward. Now, before we jump into this video, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe to the channel. Also double check to make sure YouTube has not unsubscribed you. They love to do that to people. I also want to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Patriot Gold Group. With the Fed currently pivoting to cut rates, that means just one thing, that there is going to be more money printing. We see that the job market is also cracking, and there's a lot of concerns also about mortgage rates and also mortgage distress, and the searches are all the way back up to 2008 levels. There are major voices in the finance industry that are also warning of, that 2026 could be more explosive than we've ever seen before. And all of this is happening while our national debt skyrockets and passes $38 trillion. Now, on the flip side, there have been a lot of positive movements when it comes to gold, and major banks are also saying that gold could reach potentially $5,000 or even more an ounce. And look, I know if you're a gun owner, you already understand that hedging against uncertainty really means a lot to you. And when the system kind of gets shaky, you want to protect yourself and protect what matters. And your finances should also not be any different. You should also protect that as well. Patriot Gold Group helps Americans secure their retirement with physical gold and silver delivered to your doorstep or stored in a no-fee for life IRA. They specialize in helping you roll over your IRA or your 401k into real, tangible precious metals like gold and silver, and that is something that you actually own. So if you're interested, call the proud Americans over at the Patriot Gold Group today before it's too late, and mention Armed Scholar to get the best in class service from patriots who are focused on protecting other patriots. You can also call 888-581-3830 for your free investor guide to learn more about protecting your money with Patriot Gold Group. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be discussing a new Supreme Court case that was argued in front of the Supreme Court, and it's set to be decided by the court. And it involves when police can enter someone's home without a warrant. This case tries to use a prior 9-0 unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court, which involved the warrantless entry into the home. This new challenge pending in front of the court and set to be decided is called Case versus Montana. This challenge is important for gun owners because it involves when law enforcement potentially can use legal workarounds to not only enter your home without a warrant, but also potentially confiscate your firearms. Now, the facts surrounding this case are interesting. Essentially, Trevor Case's ex-girlfriend called police saying that he had called her and that she had a bad feeling. And when her and the police arrived at his house, she told them that she couldn't remember exactly what he had said, but she had a bad feeling, and that she also potentially heard that he had a gun. And she was also worried that maybe he would try to also shoot at police if they entered the home. Apparently, all the police officers knew Mr. Case. They kind of had a history, and they also knew that he had some mental health issues. When the 4 police officers arrived at the home, they looked through all the windows into the rooms and did not see Mr. Case. One of the police officers noticed an empty handgun that was holstered and also a notepad, I believe. And the officer kind of knocked on the door, shined flashlights through the windows, called for Mr. Case, but he did not respond. Now, during this incident, many of the officers expressed concerns about entering the home because of prior interactions with Mr. Case, but others stated that they did not think that Trevor would do anything to them, that he didn't have the guts and things like that. And after about 40 minutes at the house, the police officers decided to enter the home through the front door, which was unlocked. When the 4 police officers entered the home, 2 went upstairs, and one of the officers entered an upstairs bedroom where he saw a closet curtain kind of jerk open and it revealed Mr. Case's face. And the police officer said that he also saw something like a black object. The officer then shot Case in the arm, which passed through to his stomach. And after that, they handcuffed him and they searched the room and they recovered a handgun, which they claimed was lying near a laundry basket. Because of this incident, Mr. Case was charged with multiple violations, and Case argued that the officer's warrantless entry into his house actually violated the 14th Amendment, so the gun and other evidence should actually be suppressed. Now, those arguments were rejected by the lower courts, and eventually this made its way to the Montana Supreme Court, and they rejected that as well in a 4-3 split decision. And ultimately, this made its way to the Supreme Court, and Mr. Case asked for a Supreme Court review. They granted review to this case, and recently they held oral arguments in this challenge. Now, in his petition, Mr. Case argues that the Supreme Court should apply the 4th Amendment's probable cause rules to these emergency aid situations like his, and they asked for the court to vacate the Montana ruling, which used a lesser reasonable suspicion standard. Case also argued that the search was not justified under the community caretaking doctrine, which was also struck down and rejected by the Supreme Court in a case called Caniglia versus Strom. Now, in this case, both the Trump administration and the state of Montana argued for probable cause to be rejected by the Supreme Court, and they said that it should not apply to these emergency aid cases. In fact, the Trump administration asked for a sliding scale kind of style of reasonable suspicion to be applied in these types of situations. Now, after listening to the oral arguments that took place recently, my impression is that this case will really kind of hinge on the fact that Montana and the Montana Supreme Court did not properly apply the U.S. Supreme Court's prior decisions in cases like Brigham City versus Stewart and Caniglia versus Strom. Now, in these oral arguments during the case challenge, the justices kind of focused a lot on the fact that the Montana Supreme Court did not properly apply that standard. Instead, they used kind of a lesser standard of reasonable suspicion or something even looser. In fact, at one point, you had Justice Barrett kind of call out the Montana Supreme Court's ruling in the case, and she even called it sloppy, which is some strong language coming from Justice Barrett. And it appeared that the majority, if not all of the justices, actually agreed that the Montana Supreme Court got the analysis wrong, and they did not properly apply the precedent that was laid out by the Supreme Court. The question then is kind of what would the Supreme Court do about that? Many of the justices asked if they should simply vacate and remand the case to Montana and the Supreme Court there and, say that they need to apply the Brigham City standard, or there was questions if they should decide the case themselves, apply a standard, give guidance to lower courts, and, kind of settle this on their own. Now, during those arguments, Mr. Case's counsel primarily pushed for the Supreme Court to apply the Fourth Amendment probable cause jurisprudence on these emergency aid cases. However, I do not think that any of the Supreme Court justices were in favor of doing that. Instead, it seems like they're going to just maybe at the best remand this case back down to the Montana Supreme Court and say that they need to apply the Brigham City case. So out of these oral arguments, I think that this will lead to two potential outcomes. Both will lead to the Supreme Court reversing the Montana Supreme Court. First, either the Supreme Court will simply vacate and remand the case back down to Montana in the Montana Supreme Court, saying to simply apply the Brigham City case. This option was mentioned by justices like Barrett and Roberts. Now, the other option is something that was also entertained, and it was simply to reverse and remand the case, but also for the Supreme Court to apply Brigham City on their own and provide further guidance for lower courts on how to rule in these types of emergency aid cases. So if the Supreme Court went that route, they would look at the facts of Mr. Case's situation and see if the police officers had an objectively reasonable basis to enter the home. So this is a very important case because it impacts everyone's protections against these types of warrant exceptions. The Supreme Court now has an opportunity to clarify or potentially expand upon some of the prior 9-0 unanimous decisions in cases like Caniglia in Brigham City, and that has serious downstream implications for our types of protections against these kind of warrantless home entries by police officers. So those are some of the main takeaways from what happened during the Supreme Court's oral arguments. And now this term, we are waiting to see how is the Supreme Court going to rule in this case. And again, I suspect that this will be another huge decision, potentially another 9-0 decision by the Supreme Court in line with these warrantless entry cases, which will ultimately impact all of our rights going forward. So we will be watching closely to see what happens, but as we get more information as it develops, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. But as always, thank you guys so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.